As Russia gathered tens of thousands of troops along its border with Ukraine in the months before invading the country, Vladimir Putin began issuing demands to the West. In mid-December 2021, Russia submitted draft documents outlining security arrangements it wanted to negotiate with the United States and NATO, as Washington for weeks had been seeking diplomatic solutions to de-escalate from what U.S. officials were already calling the opening moves of a possible invasion. One of the Kremlin's top demands near the top of the list, NATO should ban Ukraine from ever joining its alliance. While NATO, the U.S., and other allies rejected this demand and have even downplayed the Ukraine-NATO issue as a reason for Russia's invasion, NATO also avoided adding Ukraine despite requests from the country to join over several years. Here's why Ukraine hasn't become a member of NATO and whether it has any chance of joining in the future. Relations between Ukraine and NATO were formally established in 1992 when Ukraine joined the North Atlantic Cooperation Council after regaining its independence, later renamed the Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council, but the nature of the partnership remained loose. Ukraine's president, Viktor Yushchenko, hoped to change that. He had been swept to power during the 2004-2005 Orange Revolution, protests that were prompted by reports of electoral fraud. Yushchenko promised the protesters a future that did away with Ukraine's corrupt, Kremlin-dominated past. Much like Georgia, another former Soviet state, Ukraine saw NATO membership as one route to shake off Russian influence. At the beginning of 2008, the Ukrainian president, prime minister, and head of parliament sent an official letter, the so-called Letter of Three, to apply for the Membership Action Plan. President George W. Bush was a supporter of Yushchenko's plan. "Your country has made a bold decision, and the United States strongly supports your request," he said during a visit to Ukraine in April. Russia, however, was openly hostile to Ukrainian membership in NATO. The Kremlin opposed any eastward expansion of the alliance, and Russian President Vladimir Putin warned that NATO membership would force Russia to treat Ukraine as an enemy. Russia's opposition caused consternation among some NATO members, and that consternation proved vital. Germany's government has indicated they would oppose invitations for Ukraine and Georgia, and France joined them in citing concerns about upsetting relations with Russia. "We are opposed to the entry of Georgia and Ukraine because we think that it is not a good answer to the balance of power within Europe and between Europe and Russia," said the French Prime Minister François Fillon. France's European Affairs Minister Jean-Pierre Jouyet also expressed his doubts. Europe should give Dmitry Medvedev, who will succeed Vladimir Putin as president, a chance to settle in his new position and wait what he has to say. The German government also had serious concerns about admitting Georgia and Ukraine. For one thing, officials said Berlin does not want NATO to be dragged into any territorial dispute between Georgia and Russia. Unresolved conflicts over the separatist Georgian regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia have caused tension between Georgia and Russia. Berlin dreads the idea of NATO being asked by Georgia to interfere in these disputes by, for example, invoking Article 5, in which the alliance is obliged to come to the assistance of a member if it is attacked or threatened with an attack. Russian rhetoric, German officials said, encouraged some of the anti-NATO sentiment, especially in eastern Ukraine. In any event, the West Europeans would prefer a national consensus over joining NATO rather than encouraging divisions that Russia could exploit. Because NATO operates on consensus, the opposition of any single country can block any alliance decision. During NATO's 2008 summit in Bucharest, Romania, the issue was discussed and, after opposition from France and Germany, a decision was made to offer neither Ukraine nor Georgia a NATO membership action plan, essentially a path for Ukraine and Georgia to receive membership at that moment. Vague promises of NATO membership in the future were made, but the United States later appeared to drop its support for NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia. Russia's brief war with Georgia in August 2008 helped underscore the decision's importance, but NATO and Ukraine had further talks in December. Again, however, no specific membership action plan was announced. Ukraine's hope of joining NATO finally ended in 2010 when Yushchenko lost the presidential election to Viktor Yanukovych, the man he had helped oust during the Orange Revolution. Yanukovych announced that he didn't see a need for further integration with NATO. Speaking in May 2010, he explained that it was an unrealistic prospect for Ukraine. In June, Ukraine's parliament passed a bill that confirmed the country's non-aligned status and effectively canceled any prospect of joining NATO. Yanukovych began to pursue a more Kremlin-friendly foreign policy. Today, it's tempting to put Ukraine's failure to join NATO down to Russian subterfuge and European feebleness, but there are other important factors here: Ukrainian public opinion and opposition parties. Multiple polls conducted around that time showed that Ukrainians viewed NATO with suspicion. One Gallup poll from May 2008 found that 43% of Ukrainian adults viewed the alliance as a threat. Also, a vision of joining NATO was met with antipathy from the opposition parties within Ukraine, who called for a national referendum on any steps toward further involvement with NATO. Yushchenko had avoided calls for a referendum on the issue, and when Bush visited Kiev in April 2008, he was greeted by angry crowds carrying signs that said things such as, "Yankee, go home." Ukrainian politicians, such as the then Minister of Defense of Ukraine, Yuri Yakanarov, and the then Prime Minister of Ukraine, Yulia Tymoshenko, stated Ukraine would not join NATO as long as the public continued opposing the move. Later that year, the Ukrainian government started an information campaign aimed at informing the Ukrainian people about the benefits of membership. A few years later, in 2014, the mood had shifted drastically after protests deposed Ukraine's then-president Viktor Yanukovych and Russia's annexed Crimea. A Ukrainian pollster found in July of that year that 44% of Ukrainians supported becoming a part of the alliance, representing the first time a plurality of Ukrainians were in favor. Just 19% of people had felt the same way in a similar question the group asked in 2012. So, when the Ukrainians might expect their country to join NATO? The predictions are not so optimistic. In March 2016, the then president of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, stated that it would take at least 20 to 25 years for Ukraine to join the European Union and NATO. Now, the ongoing conflict may only stretch this prediction in time. Don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and share. Also, visit our second channel with military power comparisons. See you next time.